After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5, f5, and now we're going to go through some stuff we haven't seen in the past. Let's start with a couple of lines with knight c3. So as we know, we take the pawn, knight takes back, and now knight f6. Now here the novelty will be the following. After queen e2, we play d5, and when they take, you take back. And now castle is a move we've never seen before. So let's continue. Here you play queen e7, and now two options. If white goes on with with pawn to d3, here's the plan. Very simple. Bishop g4, and this is a really annoying pin. Our opponent can do nothing about it. Let's say h3, you keep the pin. Rook to e1, placing the rook in the appropriate file. Queen to g7. Remove the king and the queen from the save file, and also threaten to just, you're just going to build up the pressure on the opponent king. So let's say, for example, d4. Attacking the pinned pawn, the idea of swapping everything. Rook to g8. And now this move cannot be played because you're threatening mate. What can be done to stop this? g4 doesn't work because you're just going to sacrifice, right? You're going all in. Okay, g3. Fine, you play e4. The knight is pinned and you're winning material. You might argue this is not going to work because, well, obviously we're threatening knight e4 is a deadly move. Well, the knight is pinned. There's nothing to do here. You just can't stop this capture. So the thing is, you're going to take with the bishop. Let's make an example. If bishop takes knight, pawn takes, and now queen a6 with some sort of idea of bothering our king, it's not a problem. Take this knight for free. And after the check, queen d7 forces a swap of queens. Also, we're threatening queen h3 with an unstoppable checkmate, even taking the rook here. When you're done moving the king, say king to f7. Now you're going to play queen h3 and then checkmate. Although you might argue that the queen has an attack on this pawn and it's going to come with check. But there's nothing. So let's say if it was black to move again, you will just take this pawn. Queen d5 check, king g7. That's it. There is no coming back here. So back in this position, you might argue, okay, what about queen e3? This is the best move according to the engine. The reason is simple. You're still pinning this pawn, and if black takes this knight, queen can take the knight for free. Queen can take the bishop back, and the pawn is pinned. So now you long castle. The knight looks like the knight is free to go. But there's no good squares. And if you think about it, there's just too much of an attack on this king. Knight h4, the idea of going to f5, you will play knight to e7. Stopping knight f5. And it's not like this could have been avoided, by the way, here. Instead of knight h4 now, straight after black castle long, if bishop takes, you don't need to take back actually, you just take this knight. And now the bishop is still under attack, so when the bishop moves away, you're going to play f5, and the game plays itself. You're going to play the usual thematics, bishop d6, f4, and then smash the king side. Okay, so it's just too strong. So straight after long castle, knight h4, you play knight e7. Now you see what the plan is, that's how you play. c4. By white, these are all best moves now. We're threatening to simply take this pawn, open the file on the king. a6 is the move. Bishop has to go to a4, f5. This is happening no matter what. Pawn takes in d5. At least now the pawn in e4 is secured. Queen f6 is the best move, threatening to win the knight for free. Knight to g2. And it's not like knight g2 looks ugly, but it's not like king g2, for example, works to unpin this pawn, because you're simply going to play knight takes d5 with an attack on the queen. Nowhere to go for the queen except queen to d2, let's say, but now you play f4, threatening to smash everything around here. My position has been evaluated -4 or something. So let's go back. Right here, knight to g2. Knight takes, d5 comes anyway, queen d2, f4, right? So this is happening no matter what. And there's no way to stop it. If, let's say, here's the plan. You're going to take this pawn. So if rook takes pawn in e4, it seems for free. But then you take this pawn and the game plays itself. If instead g4, trying to close the file, keep it closed. Bishop e4, queen has to move. Now you just take this rook. There's a huge advantage. Besides, also, whenever the bishop gets taken, the knight in g2 will be pinned, so you just play f3. So let's make a recap. Knight c3, take, knight f6, queen e2, d5, take, take, and now castle. Queen e7 comes now. So we've seen so much trouble happening because of bishop g4, this our thematic move. What if white plays h3 straight away? Now, this is obviously the best option for white. It's a necessary move to prevent bishop g4 disaster, but you gotta play rook g8, and you're already well placed. So king h2, let's look at this idea. Obviously, we gotta play king d8 now, unpinning the knight, meaning that later we're gonna have jumps of the knight to d4. Potentially, if our opponent takes us, we've got an unbelievable center, plus, I mean, you look at this amazing center, plus the bishop pair. Nothing to ask more for this. d3, developing, queen to d7. And here's what we're threatening. Let's make an example. If white plays a developing move, any move, like let's say bishop d2, right, just to make the point. Rook g2. Hehe. Check, king takes, then check, king moves only square, check. King moves, check. Now obviously blocking with the knight, you can't do it because the queen will fall. Although that is kind of the best thing that our opponent can do, believe it or not. Because it's either about losing the queen or... Well, they are going to lose the queen anyway. Anyway, now we play bishop to g4. It's impossible to defend that knight more, so we're going to take this. It's going to be a massive disaster. It's game over. If instead, after the queen h5, okay, after the check, king h1, check. What about king g2? Well, okay, now you just give a check here, and you're gonna make a discover check. If the king goes back, then you got a checkmate, right? If the king goes instead further away, you got discover check, and it comes with an attack on the queen. So back in this position, a move like bishop d2 just fails miserably because we're going all in for g2. What about knight h4, putting more protection over that square? Still rook g2. Knight takes back, check, king moves. It looks like now this knight is some sort of a good defender, at least in preventing mate. But now you played knight d4, and that's gonna be it. White has to give up the queen. Knight f3 is gonna be checkmate, so white will have to give up the queen. There's no way around that. So one more line in this position. We mentioned this unbelievable plan of rook g2 is a super strong move. What about rook g1? This is the most solid way to try and resist. Okay, bishop to d6, and already there's a massive threat, e4. Winning material. So king back to h1, queen to f7. White can't make a single developing move with this bishop. All of these squares are ugly. Bishop h6, that's absolutely nothing. So let's see a couple of lines lying. One of them is g4. White might try to play this move, the idea of opening the files and obviously probably make a swap, then reinsert the queen through this, to the king side, and see how things go. You play h5, so you deal with this in the usual way. If bishop takes knight now, you just ignore it. You take this pawn, coming with a threat on the knight. It's too strong. Let's say they take, you take. So if they save the bishop, take this with an attack on the queen. And after the swap, they might take this pawn. And now simply c6. The bishop has to go back. Oh, by the way, queen f6 check is not good, because when you attack the queen, there's going to be a queen hanging and the bishop hanging. So after the bishop goes to a4, queen h8, finalizing the pressure on the pawn in h3, king to g2. Obviously h2 is not possible because discover check on the attack on the queen. King to g2, defending that more, king to e7. With a very simple plan of bishop takes this with check with the arrival of the rook. Position evaluated -6. So back in this position, we just took this pawn and we saved the bishop, but then we saw that you take the knight and it's a disaster. What if they simply quietly capture back? Well, now you still don't recapture this bishop. Play bishop g4, pinning this knight, but most importantly, threatening these checks. And this is going to be like some sort of lawnmower situation here. It's pretty tragic, as you can see. Rook takes bishop is obviously the only thing left to do. And now you may say, okay, yeah, we got to recapture the rook, but still, our opponent has taken 2 pieces for a rook. Besides, white still has the bishop pair, but if they save the bishop, then you play e4. The knight has to move, and when the knight moves, you're going to make a lawnmower situation here. Besides, even if the knight, even if, I don't know, pawn takes, but then you also have this check. It's going to be checkmate next move. So back in this position, what if white does take the pawn? I say, you know, I'm happy to swap pieces and see, you know, if I can reduce the initiative. We do swap, and then the same stuff. The bishop's attacking here, the queen's attacking here. This is a horrible position. Also, after king d7, we're going to involve the rook. What if knight takes, and now it looks like the queen's defending here, the knight's defending there. It looks all good, but knight d4, you completely miss this move. The queen's got nowhere to go. Wherever she goes, she will have to give up material. One last recap. Okay, the early knight c3, take, knight f6, queen e2, d5, take, and now castle. Queen e7. h3 has to come, rook to g8. King h2, king to d8, d3, and queen to d7, right? So we look at the most solid way to defend now that we have this unbelievable plan over g2 and sacrifice g2 and queen h3, rook g1, bishop to d6, very strong bishop, king to h1, and now queen to f7. Now, earlier we went to g4, so that is met with h5. Always remember these patterns. What about when they take this knight? Okay, well, take back. And now the plan is simple. If it was your move again, you will play queen h5, threatening e4, and you know, everything is happening next. You're gonna take here, take, check, knight blocks, queen checkmate. All of that is happening. Also, I mean, obviously it's not your move now. So let's say white plays knight to h2, right? This move makes perfect sense. He allows the queen more freedom, the knight to potentially jump to other squares. It offers more support to g4 later on. We play rook b8, putting pressure on this pawn. And now if white develops the bishop, let's say you take this pawn, and yes, they take your pawn, but these rooks are much more advanced. It's like, you know, the rook, position related minus 250. It's obviously a advantageous situation for black. Let's make an example. Take. It looks like this pawn cannot be doubled up, so white can just remove the rook from there. However, you're going to play d4. And this bishop is actually trapped, so it will take rook b7 to simply win that bishop. So you might say, okay, white will challenge this. Fine, but you take the rook. Rook takes back, and now the queen is coming here with a fork. So back in this position, after rook b8, what about b3, trying to make a fianchetto here? Black goes on with queen g6, and the obvious threat of bishop takes pawn in h3, and the pawn is pinned. Well, then we will checkmate. So queen to f3 offers more protection to that square. Black goes on with c5. The idea of simply placing the bishop in this amazing diagonal at this point, if the white queen takes the pawn, let's say abandons the defense of h3, you can take in h3. It's an excellent move. What about knight g4? Simply the idea of taking here in f6 with check, double defense over that square, meaning that we are forced to trade queens and lose the initiative. We have to play f5 now. And that's it. We're not letting that happen. Knight to h6, attacking the rook. The knight is protected by the bishop. So even if we play f4 to stop the influence of the bishop, we're going to lose the rook. So we just quietly play rook g7. And then after playing f4, the knight will be gone from there, and you can play a move like, let's say, for example, h5. And then keep building the attack, bishop b7. It's an amazing position. So what if white tries g4 now? We play f4. And after g5, protecting the knight, what's going on here? e4. This is just too strong. We got too much control of those squares. We are going to go to h3 no matter what. This pawn cannot be taken. Obviously, I mean, it just helps us even more. What if the queen goes to d1? Well, then e3. The queen has now abandoned the control of the square h3. You're gonna, you know, if let's say if the pawn blocks this diagonal of the bishop, you play queen h5, finalizing the attack on that pawn. No way to stop it. Let's change topic now. So a bishop b4, bishop b5, f5, knight c3. Okay, take, knight f6. What about when they take immediately? Fine, we have to take with the queen. And now the novelty is the following. Queen e2. There are two attackers on this pawn. And our opponent is threatening to simply take the knight and win the pawn and force a trade of queens and go to a winning endgame. What are we going to do about it? Bishop e7. Now after bishop takes knight, we take back with the b pawn. Two ways to take this pawn. What about queen takes e5? Fine. Now we are going to play d6. So yes, we're okay with the queen swap because after take, we're going to have the bishop pair, and you see how to take the game from now. Castle, bishop e6. They can pin us, but it's not a problem because after king d7, you're okay. There's nothing there. d4, pawn in the center, h6. This is because now the bishop was cooperating on the diagonal with the knight, and the knight was threatening to play. Well, it was threatening to play knight to rook e1, knight g5. So h6 is the move to play here. h3, stopping potential bishop g4. How do we deal with these dull positions? a5, rook e1, king d7, and this is how we're going to be castling. c3, this is important because if you want to move this knight, this pawn is going to fall. So you play c3, build a pawn chain, a4, and remember this is the plan. a4. Okay, knight h2 with the idea of going to g4, rook h2 b8, and we're going to finalize our attack on the queen side. Let's make an example of how this attack goes on, and we're going to change line. Knight to g4, attacking the bishop. Take the knight, crazy enough. Giving away the bishop pair in an open endgame, even though we're down a pawn. What's going on here? Pawn takes back. And now even more surprising, c5. Our opponent can take this pawn, and we can't even recapture because these two pawns will be double up and isolated. We're threatening to take this pawn, put the bishop in a glorious diagonal. When white takes a3, just throwing one pawn after another. Okay, now if the pawn takes, then bishop c3 makes a fork. We're going to winning endgame. If rook b1 to protect it, pawn takes, and then we're going to play rook a2. It's completely winning. So if the pawn gets taken, rook a2 is coming anyway. There's no way around. We got double attack on the bishop. If the bishop moves away, fine, you take you take the bishop. Rook takes back, bishop c3 makes a fork. Wherever the rook moves, doesn't matter. You're going to take this one, take this back, pawn takes. And these two pawns are going to win, even though they're isolated, because you're just going to support them with the king. You're just going up with the king. Obviously, don't go there, as I'm showing by the arrows, because you're going to lose the rook. But you can do these zigzags, you can push the pawn and find your way out. Completely winning for black. Let's change line. So that was an example of how to conduct a plan in such position. What about here, back at this position, when we lost the pawn in e5? This is obviously theoretically lost. What about knight taking instead of the queen? Fine, you play queen e6, and now you're pinning the knight, meaning that white can't castle. If white castles, you just play d6. Let's make an example. Castle, d6, right? The knight is pinned. What about queen check? g6. The sacrifice doesn't work because you can take the queen. So back in this position, castling is obviously not possible. What about d4? Protecting the knight, allowing development of the pieces. Bishop f6, put more pressure on that knight. And see, now the white player, you realize that he's going to pay for being a pawn grabber without finishing development. Two options we're going to look at. One of them, let's say castle now. Obviously, this still just loses, right? You're going to play d6. In this case, there's a difference. They might play f4. This is annoying. I've encountered this move, so it's important to make a video about this. You are going to take the knight. You're winning a piece. Obviously, if they take with a d pawn, you're up a piece. Castle. They can't really take the bishop back because you're going to win the opponent queen. So you're just up a piece. If they take with the f pawn, still castle. And yes, white does have these 2 pawns in the center, but you got the bishop pair, you're up a piece. So we're not going to really look at this line. So back here, what if white develops the piece? Bishop e3. I'm pinning this knight, basically. Not that it was pinned right now, but it prevented white from castling. Fine, we castle. And now it looks like finally white can manage the castle in peace. d6 is coming. And now the knight will have to move. And now 2 things are left to do with this knight. It's either taking this pawn or going back. The game is open and like a lot of things can happen, so I'm not going to be able to cover all the things that can happen. We can only discuss all the plans here. So let's say if they take the pawn, d5, and now you threaten to take this knight. And if the knight goes back to e5 now, you don't really have that great advantage. We're gonna play with we're gonna give up the bishop pair, and then play bishop a6, right? And you're gonna win the exchange. This is the best that the computer can come up with in such a line. It's a very boring line. It's a very dull line. But this is what happens when your opponent decides to swap everything. It means that their chances of winning are decreasing, but also the chances of you enjoying the game are decreasing. Look, here's the thing about players that swap pieces. They hate chess. So back in this position, here, after the knight takes the pawn in c6, we just play pawn to d5. Instead of knight back to e5, what about knight to b4? Keeping an eye on e6 and just continuing the game. Now here the plan is c5. We're attacking this knight, meaning, obviously, well, if the knight takes and pawn takes in e4, the bishop is pinned. But there's a crazy line that is about to happen, a really crazy line. It looks like this pawn can indeed be taken because, yes, the bishop is pinned. You can play d4 and you should play d4. But the best move now, according to the engine, is queen to f3. And this is all a line to remember. It's a crazy line. So get ready. You take the bishop. They take the rook. And now take this pawn with an attack on the rook. Rook has to move, attacking the bishop, coming on the open file, pawn check. Now, obviously, now king takes pawn and then rook takes king. Now, the king should not move away because then you can play bishop a6. You're attacking this rook whilst the rook's attacking the queen. The rook can't really take this pawn for that reason. However, there is a temporary way out for white, which is queen to d5, forcing a trade of queens. And basically, after doing this and that, you don't take here because then you lose this. And you're going to play bishop d4, saving the bishop pair, defending this pawn. And now you are winning the exchange, although you might say you are down the exchange. Okay, so let's look at this move. Knight to c7 with an attack on the bishop. Yes, the bishop is going to take the rook. We all know that. But knight e6 attacks the rook and attacks the bishop. Both pieces are very weak. And you can't really save the bishop in any way. So you're going to lose material. However, you just take the rook. And now, if knight e6 comes, you play rook e8. You don't care about this bishop because rook to e1 will win the game. Yes, the rook will be able to give you a bunch of checks, but then you go to f7, then to g6, and that's going to be it. There's not going to be any checks left. So back here, if the rook takes the bishop, then rook to c8 simply ends the pain. Okay, you might argue knight e6, you're attacking this. But now, once again, rook e8. And now it's inevitable. We go in there. So back in this position, straight after taking the pawn in f2, what if the rook takes? This looks more reasonable. However, bishop to d4 pains the rook, and now we're finalizing the attack on that rook. We're winning material. What about knight to d3? To protect it more. Take. Knight takes queen e3, finalizing the attack over here. Now you might say that this can be defended. Okay, rook f1, but now look at the position of the white player. Queen takes pawn in c5. It's a wonderful variation. White playing the best engine moves now will be queen e4. In order to get closer to the king side, you play h6 to give an escape for the king later on. If queen to e1, let's say, right? Take this pawn. King moves. Also because, if not, bishop a6 will be trapping the rook. So king h1, and now you take this pawn, and you're winning because of this passed pawn. Knight e4, for example, just to, you know, it's just that you're enjoying more freedom. That's the thing. Take. Queen d5, attacking the knight. And I think we're gonna have to start pushing here. Obviously, a move like queen f3 is met with bishop b7, it's game over. A move like knight c3, attacking the queen, is met with queen e5. And now it's on you to win this endgame. The good thing is your opponent can't really move the queen away from that back rank without huge trouble. You're going to have to find a way to promote that pawn. Position evaluated -4. Obviously, it's a complete win. So back a couple of moves. Instead of queen e1, what about queen e2? To protect the pawn in c2. Rook to f6. To support the bishop in e6, you'll see. King h1. Also because you see rook f6, you're also threatening. See, if you play bishop a6, for instance, and you know it's a skewer, and then if the queen checks you and then you move, whenever the queen runs out of checks, you're gonna be you keep pinning this knight, and then the bishop will move this attack the rook. The rook can't really move away. So in this position, after king h1, what about now? Okay, knight play bishop e6. The knight is no longer pinned. Okay, knight to d3, attacking the queen. What to do? Simply take here. You're attacking the queen. If the queen takes, you're giving a checkmate. It's a completely winning position.